On the machine's main screen, the words warning, core system overload, initiating emergency discharge appeared. Professor Croft's spirit froze, his face showing surprise and anger for the first time. No. What have you done? That's the safety discharge. It will release all the stored energy. A secret door on the floor, right at Professor Croft's feet, sprang open, revealing a spiral staircase leading down into utter darkness. A strong, cold wind blew up from below, carrying with it the groans and cries of dozens of souls. "This is the way to the quarantine zone," Maya yelled over the alarm. "Where he locked everyone up." Professor Croft roared in fury, his form beginning to flicker and blur. "You cannot ruin my work. I won't allow it." He lunged toward them, but the powerful energy from the floor seemed to hold him back, pulling him down. This was their only chance. "Run!" Maya screamed at Ben, who was still frozen in shock. She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the main door, the one Professor Croft had opened. They burst out of the lab, running for their lives down the dark corridor, the furious roars of Professor Croft and the deafening alarm echoing behind them. They didn't know where they were going, only that they had to get as far away from that place as possible. They ran through the main hall, where the slashed portrait seemed to watch them with hateful eyes. They pushed open the main doors and rushed out into the cold Havenwood Peak air. They didn't stop until they were outside the hospital gates, back on the highway. They stood panting, looking back at the ghostly building, which had now fallen silent again. But they knew that inside, the gates of hell had been opened. They had learned the truth, a truth more terrifying than any ghost story. But they had also awakened the wrath of the one who created that hell. The confrontation was not over. It had only just begun. Professor Croft knew of their existence. And he would not let his new patients escape so easily. Their brief freedom felt like a cruel joke. When Maya and Ben got back to the hotel, they thought they were safe. But the nightmare had only changed its form. That night, Maya couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Professor Croft's face, his black eyes boring into her mind. His whispers echoed in her ears, not from outside, but from within her own head, "I see you. The girl who carries pain. Such a beautiful soul to heal." Ben was no better. He sat huddled in a chair, his eyes glued to a meaningless program on TV. He was no longer the practical, skeptical engineer. He had seen the undeniable, and it had shattered his worldview. "He followed us," Ben said, his voice trembling. "I can feel him. It's so cold." They couldn't stay in Havenwood Peak any longer. Early the next morning, they hastily packed, checked out, and caught the earliest bus back to the city. But leaving the misty town didn't mean they had escaped the curse of Serenity Hills. On the bus, Maya dozed off from exhaustion. In her dream, she saw her younger brother, the one who had died from a severe illness. But her brother wasn't smiling. He stood at the end of the hospital corridor, his face pale, his eyes empty. "Sister, save me," he said, but the voice that came out was that of one of the ghost children from Serenity Hills. Then Professor Croft appeared behind him, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder and smiling at Maya. "You see, I can save everyone. Even the ones you've lost." Maya jolted awake, her entire body ice cold. She understood now. Professor Croft didn't just want to imprison them. He was using her own pain, her loss, and her past trauma to manipulate and entice her. He saw in Maya a special host, someone with a strong connection to the suffering of children. Back in the city, they tried to return to their normal lives, but it was futile. Ben quit his job, shut himself in his house, lost weight, and became paranoid. Maya couldn't focus on anything either. The ghost of Professor Croft and Serenity Hills haunted her every second. Objects in her apartment moved on their own, the TV would turn on to a children's channel in the middle of the night, and she always felt like someone was watching her. She knew she couldn't run forever. Running only made Professor Croft's spirit stronger, giving him more power over her. She had to go back. Not to survey, but to end it all. To free the children's souls and destroy Professor Croft once and for all. Maya sought out Mrs. Lawn. She got the old vegetable seller's address from a local. Mrs. Lawn lived in a small house at the end of an alley, surrounded by medicinal herbs. When she saw Maya, she wasn't surprised. "I knew you would come back," she said, her voice strangely calm. Mrs. Lawn invited Maya in and poured her a cup of hot ginger tea. Only then did she tell her full story. She wasn't a nurse. Her older sister had been the head nurse who worked with Professor Croft. Her sister was one of the people trapped and killed in the hospital that night. "My sister tried to save the children," Mrs. Lawn recounted, her eyes welling with tears. She realized Croft's therapy was a form of dark magic. She was going to report everything. But it was too late. Mrs. Lawn gave Maya an old diary that belonged to her sister. In it, her sister had detailed Professor Croft's transformation, from a medical genius to a madman obsessed with immortality. More importantly, the diary recorded the weakness of the Morning Light Project. His serum tethers the soul by creating a powerful electromagnetic bond with the nervous system and the very structure of the hospital. Maya read a passage aloud. "It turns the entire hospital into a psychic Faraday cage. To break this bond, a sufficiently powerful electromagnetic shock must be delivered to the heart of the system, the laboratory itself." A plan began to form in Maya's mind. She needed Ben. Only he, with his engineer's knowledge, could help her do this. Maya went to Ben's house. He had become a shadow of his former self, gaunt, unshaven, and filled with fear. "Go away. Leave me alone," he yelled when he saw her. "Ben, listen to me." Maya grabbed his shoulders. "We can't run. The only way is to face him. I have a plan. I need you. Those children need us." She showed him the diary. As Ben read the lines about an electromagnetic shock and a psychic Faraday cage, the light of an engineer, a scientist, flickered in his vacant eyes. For the first time in days, the fear in him was replaced by a concrete goal. The hospital's old electrical system. Ben muttered. "If we can restart the backup generator and short-circuit all the main lines into the lab, we could create a massive electromagnetic pulse, EMP. It would be like an EMP bomb, disabling all electronic devices. And maybe even break Professor Croft's psychic bond." It was an insane and extremely dangerous plan. They would have to return to the heart of the storm, to face the demon that haunted them. But they had no other choice. A few days later, Maya and Ben returned to the Serenity Hills Pediatric Institute. This time, they didn't bring cameras or measuring tapes. They carried large spools of electrical wire, bolt cutters, electrical meters, and an iron will. The hospital greeted them with a silence even more terrifying than before. As if it knew why they had returned. They went straight to the basement, where the old generator was located. The massive machine was covered in dust and cobwebs, but Ben, with his expertise, believed he could get it started. While Ben wrestled with the machine, Maya went up to the treatment ward. She had to lure Professor Croft and the children's spirits to the laboratory. She had to be the bait. As she stepped into the familiar corridor, the whispers and giggles started again. Small white shadows flitted past doorways. But this time, Maya wasn't afraid. She felt pity. "Hello," she called out softly. "I know you're here. I know you're in pain. Follow me. I'm going to help you find peace." She walked straight to the laboratory, its door still wide open from their escape. Inside, Professor Croft's spirit was waiting. He stood in the middle of the room, his form clearer and more powerful than ever. "I knew you would return," he said, his voice full of triumph. "Your pain called to me. Come now, become the first angel of the new generation." "You're wrong, Professor Croft," Maya said, her voice steely. "What you created weren't angels, but imprisoned souls. You didn't save anyone. You were only satisfying your own selfishness." Professor Croft roared with anger. The room shook. Medical instruments flew through the air. Around Maya, the children's spirits appeared, their black, empty eyes looking at her mournfully. They began to close in, controlled by Professor Croft's will. "You don't have to listen to him anymore," Maya shouted. "Remember who you are. You're children. You deserve to rest in peace." She held out a small toy she had brought with her, a metal toy ambulance, her brother's favorite. "Look at this. Remember joy. Remember life." The children's spirits hesitated. A few of them looked at the toy, a flicker of memory seeming to spark in their empty eyes. Just then, in the basement, Ben succeeded. He yelled into the old walkie-talkie they brought, "Maya. Get ready. 10 seconds." Professor Croft realized something was wrong. "What have you done? Ending your game?" Maya yelled back. She threw the toy ambulance toward Professor Croft. At the same time, she closed her eyes and focused all her will, thinking of liberation, of peace for the children. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now. Ben's voice screamed from the walkie-talkie. A blinding blue light erupted from the laboratory floor. All the lights in the hospital flickered and then exploded. A deep boom echoed, not the sound of a physical explosion, but of something invisible being torn apart. The electromagnetic pulse spread throughout the hospital. Professor Croft's spirit let out a soul-piercing scream, his form convulsing and dissolving like a bad TV signal. "No. My work. My eternity. The children's spirits around Maya also began to fade, but not in pain. Color returned to their pale faces. Their empty eyes became clear. They looked at Maya and smiled, real smiles, full of gratitude. Then, one by one, they dissolved into tiny specks of light, floating upwards and disappearing. Professor Croft's ghost, in its final throes, lunged at Maya. But before he could touch her, his form completely disintegrated into dust. Silence enveloped the hospital. But this time, it was a serene, peaceful silence. The curse had been broken. Maya collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. Ben ran up from the basement, his face smudged but his eyes back to normal. He helped Maya up. They looked at each other, understanding without words that it was truly over. They left Serenity Hills for the last time, as the first rays of dawn shone through the pine trees. The old building stood there, silent, no longer menacing, just a ruin awaiting the judgment of time. A few months later, the hospital was demolished. Maya and Ben were there to witness it. As the last wall came down, Maya felt as if an invisible weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The obsession with her brother's death no longer tormented her. She had faced her pain, not by forgetting, but by saving other souls. 6 months passed. The city remained bustling and hurried, an effective antidote to the horrific memories of Havenwood Peak. At least, that's what Maya told herself. She and Ben had started a small architectural firm together, specializing in the restoration of old buildings. A new beginning, a way to mend the cracks in their souls by healing buildings that bore the marks of time. Ben was back to his old self. He was still the practical engineer, only now his eyes held a new depth, an understanding of things that could not be calculated by rulers and numbers. The bond between them was no longer merely professional, it had been forged in the fires of hell, becoming an unbreakable kinship. They never spoke of the Serenity Hills Pediatric Institute. That name became taboo, a memory sealed by both and stored in the most hidden corner of their minds. They had survived. They had won. That was all that mattered. However, there was one thing Maya couldn't throw away, the hardbound, deep blue ledger. She kept it in a locked drawer of her desk, telling herself it was a memento, a reminder of their courage, of the lives they had freed. Sometimes, late at night while working alone in the office, she would take it out, her fingers gently tracing the faded gold lettering, patient list, special treatment ward. It was a way to confirm that it had all really happened, that she hadn't gone mad. But recently, strange things had started to happen. Small cracks in her new normal life. It started with the dreams. They were no longer nightmares of being hunted. Instead, she dreamed she was standing in a stark white, clean, and modern laboratory. She wore a white lab coat, holding a pen, diligently taking notes in a ledger. She felt a sense of satisfaction, a burning passion as she looked at the complex formulas on the board. In the dream, she wasn't Maya. She was someone else. Someone cold, decisive, and obsessed with perfection. Then her architectural sketches began to change. While designing a restoration plan for a historic villa, she unconsciously drew strange details, corridors longer and narrower than necessary, windowless rooms, complex and tangled ventilation systems like blood vessels. Maya, "This design is a bit odd," Ben commented during a meeting, pointing at her blueprint. "Why is there such a thick wall here? It throws the whole space off balance. It looks like a quarantine room wall." Maya flinched. She looked at her drawing, then at Ben. I was just thinking about structural reinforcement," she stammered, a chill running down her spine. She had drawn it without even realizing. Unease began to gnaw at her. That evening, she opened the ledger again. She flipped to the last page, where the name Leo Carter was written. But something was different. Below that name, there was a new line of text, written in a different ink, in a slanted, sharp, and terrifyingly familiar handwriting. It was Professor Croft's handwriting. The line read, "Potential host, Maya Tran. Symptoms, high empathy, carries past trauma. Perfect for reboot." Maya froze. Her whole body went rigid. This wasn't her imagination. The writing was real. It wasn't there before. The book. It was changing. She slammed the book shut in a panic, throwing it into the corner of the room like a venomous snake. But it was too late. The connection had been established. The evil had not been entirely destroyed in the electromagnetic pulse that day. It was too strong, too old. A remnant of Professor Croft's consciousness, a demonic relic, had managed to cling to the one thing that still bore his strong imprint, the ledger that recorded the great work of his life. And now, it was looking for a new host. The following days were hell for Maya. Her personality began to split. There was the everyday Maya, who still tried to work, who still laughed and talked with Ben. And there was another Maya, a cold, calculating entity growing inside her. This other Maya loved extreme orderliness, hated imperfections, and always felt an urge to cure the flaws around her. She started to see her colleagues, friends, even Ben, as potential patients. Ben was the first to notice the terrible change. Maya was no longer warm like before. Her gaze sometimes became distant, cold. She worked relentlessly, obsessed with the smallest details. "You need to rest, Maya," Ben said, his voice full of worry. "You've been acting strange lately." "I'm fine," Maya replied, not looking up from her drawings. "The work must be perfect. There can be no flaws." That voice, though still Maya's, had a different tone, a hard, emotionless quality that Ben had never heard. The climax occurred one weekend evening. Ben went to the office to look for Maya because she wasn't answering her phone. He found her sitting motionless at her desk, holding the blue ledger, whispering to it. "Yes. Their cellular structure is unstable. Needs to be purified. A completely sterile environment." "Maya." Ben called, his heart stopping. Maya looked up. For a moment, Ben saw her eyes were completely black, without whites. The eyes of Professor Croft. "Do not disturb me," the voice that came from Maya's mouth was a man's, deep and authoritarian. "I am working." Ben realized the horrifying truth. Professor Croft wasn't just haunting Maya. He was possessing her. The ledger was the gateway, the conduit. "Give me back Maya." Ben screamed, fear turning to rage. He lunged forward, intending to snatch the book. An incredible force, unbelievable coming from Maya's small body, threw Ben back. He hit his back against a filing cabinet and fell to the floor. Maya, or rather the entity controlling her, stood up, her face emotionless, clutching the book to her chest. "She is my new host," it said. "A more perfect host than all those children. Through her, my work will be reborn." Then, as if a switch was flipped, Maya's eyes returned to normal. She blinked, looked at Ben on the floor, then at the book in her hands with utter horror. "Ben. What did I do to you?" She burst into tears, her body trembling uncontrollably. They understood. The demon had never died. It had only been dormant, waiting for its chance. And now it was back, not in an abandoned building, but in the very body of the person Ben loved most. They couldn't fight this alone anymore. The enemy this time wasn't outside, but within. Ben knew that if he tried to destroy the book, he might also destroy Maya's mind, as her consciousness and Professor Croft's were slowly merging into one. There was only one person who could help them. Ben helped the completely broken Maya out of the office. That very night, they drove straight to Havenwood Peak. They needed to find Mrs. Lawn. They needed an exorcism not for a building, but for a soul under siege. The final battle was not over. It had just moved to a new, much more terrifying battlefield, Maya's own mind. The car sped through the night, tearing through the silence of the deserted highway. Streetlights flashed across Ben's face, casting fleeting shadows that mirrored his turbulent emotions. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as if a moment's distraction would send him into the void. Beside him, Maya was curled up in the passenger seat, hugging herself tightly. She drifted in and out of consciousness. At times, she was Maya, her eyes filled with tears, looking at Ben with fear and a plea for help. "Ben, there's a voice. In my head," she sobbed. "It tells me I have to perfect everything. I'm so scared." But a few minutes later, she would fall silent. Her body would still be there, but her eyes would become distant and cold. She would sit up straight, staring out the window with contempt. "Do you think running is useful, engineer?" Professor Croft's voice would emanate from her mouth, deep and mocking. "This world is my laboratory, and this body is a perfect instrument. You can't take her anywhere I don't know. Shut up." Ben would roar, not at Maya, but at the demon residing within her. His words seemed to have an effect. Maya would jolt, her eyes returning to their familiar, bewildered state. "Ben. Did I say something again?" "It's okay," Ben would say, his voice softening, reaching over to hold her cold hand. "We're almost there. We're going to be okay. I promise." But even he didn't know if he could keep that promise. Dawn was breaking when they reached the familiar little alley. Mrs. Land's house was still there, peaceful in the early morning mist of Havenwood Peak, an oasis of calm in stark contrast to the storm in their hearts. As if expecting them, Mrs. Lawn was waiting at the door, holding a steaming pot of tea. She showed no surprise, only a deep sadness in her time-worn eyes. "Come in, you two," she said softly. She didn't need to ask many questions. Just one look at Maya's eyes and Ben's exhaustion and desperation told her everything. She had Maya sit down, handing her a hot cup of ginger tea. As Maya tremblingly brought the cup to her lips, Mrs. Lon looked at Ben and shook her head. "He didn't die completely," she whispered. "When you destroyed the cage at the hospital, most of his consciousness dissipated with the freed souls. But a remnant, the most evil and obsessive part, managed to cling to that ledger. It was like a poison seed, dormant, waiting for fertile ground to sprout." She looked at Maya with pity. And this girl's soul, with its existing wounds, was that fertile ground. "What do we do, man?" Ben asked, his voice pleading. "There has to be a way, right? Can we burn the book?" Mrs. Lon sighed. "It's not that simple, young man. By now, his consciousness and Maya's have begun to intertwine. Burning the book now would be like burning a part of her soul. I don't have the strength for this. It's beyond my knowledge." Seeing the despair on Ben's face, she continued. "But I know someone who might. Deep in the mountains, there's a recluse. People call him the Sage of Vin. He doesn't heal people, he heals objects. Haunted, cursed items. Perhaps he is your only hope." Without hesitation, Ben nodded. Anyone, any price, he had to save Maya. The journey to find the Sage of Vin was more arduous than they had imagined. They had to leave the car behind and follow a narrow trail through ancient pine forests. The air grew cleaner and colder. The deeper they went into the mountains, the more lucid Maya seemed to become. The voice in her head grew fainter, still there, but drowned out by the rustling of the wind, the chirping of birds, and the silence of nature. "It's so quiet here," Maya said, taking a deep breath. "I feel like I can breathe easier." But that peace also enraged Professor Croft. "A chaotic and imperfect system," his voice whispered in her mind, full of annoyance. "Too many uncontrollable variables. It needs to be reorganized, purified." Finally, after nearly half a day of walking, they reached a small clearing on the mountainside. In the middle of the clearing was a simple wooden house, without a fence, blending into the surrounding landscape. A thin wisp of white smoke rose from the chimney. An old man with silver hair, wearing simple brown clothes, was sitting on a rock in front of the house, holding a pipe. He watched them approach with calm, piercing eyes, as if he already knew their whole story. It was the Sage of Vin. "I have been waiting for you," he said, his voice deep and warm. The evil energy from that object announced its arrival from afar. Ben put down his backpack and carefully took out the ledger, which was wrapped in several layers of cloth. The Sage of Vin didn't touch it immediately. He just looked at it from a distance, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then he turned to look at Maya, a gaze so deep she felt he could see into her very soul. "He is not just possessing you, child," the sage said. "He is using the book as a blueprint to rewrite your soul, replacing your memories and personality with his. With each passing day, you lose a piece of yourself. Soon, there will be no Maya Tran, only Alistair Croft in a new body." His words were more terrifying than anything they had imagined. Ben knelt beside Maya, gripping her hand tightly, as if afraid she would vanish. "So what do we do, Sage?" Ben asked, his voice urgent. "We cannot use force," the sage replied, looking at Ben. "A crude exorcism would shatter her mind. We must perform a ritual of separation. To separate his consciousness from the book, and to separate its influence from her soul." He explained the plan. It would be a complex ritual requiring all three of them. The sage would lead, creating a safe space and guiding Maya deep into her own subconscious. There, in her inner world, Maya would have to fight for herself, to reclaim her identity and expel the invader. "But she will not be alone," the sage said, looking at Ben. "Your strength now lies not in your muscles or your reason. It lies in your love for her. You must be her lighthouse in the storm of her consciousness. You are the rope connecting her to reality. When she is lost in her own mind, your voice and your memories of her will be the only things to pull her back." The ritual had to be performed that night, at the peak of the full moon, when the veil between realms was at its thinnest. Following the sage's instructions, they began to prepare. Mrs. Lon, who had arrived shortly after them via a shortcut, helped them find the necessary herbs. Ben fetched water from an underground spring and found a branch of mistletoe growing on an old pine tree. As sunset fell, everything was ready. Inside the wooden house, a large circle was drawn on the floor with salt and the ashes of various herbs. Maya sat in the center of the circle. Fear was visible on her face, but mixed with it was a strong resolve. She did not want to lose herself. Ben sat opposite her, just outside the circle, holding both her hands tightly. The sage of Vin lit a strange-smelling incense, making the air thick and solemn. He began to chant in an ancient language, his voice steady and resonant. "Now, Maya," the sage said, his voice seeming to come from a great distance. "Close your eyes. Do not resist. Let your mind drift. Ben, talk to her. Do not stop. Remind her who she is." Maya closed her eyes. Her breathing gradually became deep and even. Ben squeezed her hands tighter. "Maya, it's me," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Do you remember the first time we met? At the job interview. You spilled coffee on my blueprints." He kept talking, recounting their memories, the happy stories, the silly arguments, the plans for the future. He was trying to weave a rope of memory to hold on to her. Under the effect of the chant and the incense, Maya felt her body become weightless. She was no longer in the wooden house. She was sinking, falling through layers of darkness, back to the final and most important battlefield. Her own mind. And there, Professor Croft was waiting. As Ben's voice and the sage's chanting enveloped her, Maya felt herself falling. A weightless, directionless fall through a dark and cold space. She could no longer feel Ben's hands gripping hers. She was completely alone. The fall ended abruptly. She didn't land on a floor, she simply stopped. The darkness dissolved, replaced by a blinding, cold white light that hurt her eyes. The strong smell of antiseptic filled her nostrils. To her horror, Maya realized she was standing in the main hall of the Serenity Hills Pediatric Institute. But it wasn't the dilapidated, abandoned ruin she knew. This place was brand new. The marble floor was polished to a mirror shine. The pristine white walls were flawless. The wooden reception desk was carefully polished. Even the portrait of director Alastair Croft on the wall was intact, and the eyes in the painting seemed to be watching her with a benevolent, yet terrifying, smile. This wasn't a memory. This was a prison built by Professor Croft's will. A perfect version of his lost kingdom. "Welcome, Miss Tran," a deep, warm voice said from behind her. Maya turned around. Professor Croft was standing there, not as a blurry ghost, but in flesh and blood. He wore a pristine white lab coat, his posture majestic and confident, the very picture of a director at the height of his power. He was the master of this place, and he wanted Maya to know it. "What is this?" Maya asked, her voice trembling, though she tried to hide her fear. "This is order," Professor Croft replied, spreading his arms as if to embrace the entire space. "It is perfection. A world without disease, without decay, without unexpected death. A world I could have created, had I not been hindered by the short-sighted." He approached Maya, his eyes full of conviction. "I have seen the pain within you. The obsession with loss. The death of your brother. A preventable tragedy. The medicine of that era was too weak. But I could have saved him." Maya took a step back. "You're lying." "I never lie about science," Professor Croft said, his voice firm. "Let me show you." The space around them dissolved like mist and then reformed. They were now standing in a clean, sunlit hospital room. On the pristine white bed, a little boy was playing with building blocks. It was Maya's brother. He looked healthy, rosy-cheeked, with no sign of illness. "Ethan," Maya whispered, tears streaming down her face. Her heart felt as if it were being squeezed. This was the dream she had dreamed 1,000 times. The boy looked up at her, but his eyes were empty. He smiled, a mechanical smile. "Hello, sister," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You see." Professor Croft stood beside Maya, his voice a seductive whisper. "Under my care, there is no pain. No loss. Only perfection. Accept it, Maya. Join me in rebuilding this world. Let me heal your pain. Become a part of perfection." Maya stepped toward her brother, reaching out to touch his cheek. He didn't react, just sat there like a beautiful doll. This perfection. It was so cold. It was lifeless. Just then, a faint sound pierced through the walls of this virtual world. "Maya, do you remember our first trip to Havenwood Peak? Not that time. The one back in college. You got lost, and I searched for you until I was nearly in tears." It was Ben's voice. Faint, distant, but real. Professor Croft frowned slightly. Merely an echo from an imperfect world. Pay it no mind. He waved his hand, and the image of Maya's brother became sharper. The boy stood up and walked toward her. "Stay with me, sister," he said. The temptation was immense. A world without pain. Her brother would be alive. She would no longer be tormented by guilt. And that time you got your first project, you were so happy you jumped up and knocked over a whole stack of files. I had to clean it all up. You were always so clumsy. Ben's voice came again, a little clearer this time. A real memory. Real clumsiness. A real emotion. Maya paused, looking into the empty eyes of her brother. This boy was not her brother. Her brother laughed and cried and was mischievous. Her brother wasn't perfect. Her brother was real. This boy was just a product, a puppet. She suddenly understood. Her pain, her guilt, was the proof of the love she had for her brother. To erase the pain would be to erase that love. Professor Croft's perfection was a death more empty than death itself. No, Maya said, her voice now resolute. This isn't life. This is a cage. She turned to face Professor Croft, her eyes blazing. My pain is a part of me. It proves that I loved. It makes me human. That's something a monster like you could never understand. As she finished speaking, the perfect world around them began to tremble. Cracks appeared on the pristine white walls. The polished floor began to yellow and rot. The smell of antiseptic was replaced by the familiar scent of dampness and decay. The hospital in her mind was returning to its true form, a haunted ruin. Professor Croft looked around in horror. No. What have you done? You're destroying perfection. I'm not destroying anything, Maya shouted, her willpower growing stronger. I'm restoring the truth. This place is a tomb, and you are its warden. Maya, I love you. Do you hear me? Whatever happens, please come back to me. Ben's voice now rang as clear as thunder. It was her lighthouse, the final rope pulling her out of the nightmare. His love was her strength. The world in her mind collapsed completely. Professor Croft could no longer maintain his majestic form. He shriveled, turning into a blurry, enraged ghost, pulled backward by an invisible force. No. I will not return to that box. He shrieked, his voice filled with rage and fear. This is my world. This is my mind. Maya retorted, her will now a wall of steel. And you are not welcome here. She focused all her mental strength, imagining a whirlwind enveloping Professor Croft's spirit, sucking him out of her mind. His ghost was violently pulled toward a single point of darkness, the connection to the ledger. With a final, silent scream, he was sucked into the darkness and vanished. In the real world, in the wooden house on the mountain, Maya's body was convulsing violently. Ben and Mrs. Lon watched in horror as a thick, black smoke, like ink, slowly seeped from the spine and back of the ledger lying in the center of the circle. The smoke hovered in the air, trying to form into a tormented human face. He's being expelled. The Sage of Vin shouted, his forehead beaded with sweat. He increased the volume of his chants, his voice now as powerful and authoritative as a temple bell. The black smoke tried to turn back and attack Maya but was blocked by the circle of salt and herbs, letting out mournful hisses. It then tried to lunge at Ben, but his love and connection seemed to create an invisible shield protecting them both. Helpless, the smoke was pulled back by a powerful force. With terrifying speed, the entire cloud was sucked into the ledger. The moment the last wisp of smoke disappeared, the book slammed shut with a dry thwack. A wave of invisible energy radiated from the book, extinguishing all the candles and lamps in the room. The scent of incense vanished, replaced by the acrid smell of ozone, like after a lightning strike. Silence fell. Maya's body stopped convulsing. She went limp, falling into Ben's arms, unconscious but breathing steadily. Her face was peaceful. The ledger lay motionless in the circle, looking like nothing more than an ordinary old book. The sage of Vin, exhausted, slumped to the floor, panting. He looked at Ben, who was holding Maya tightly, and gave a slight nod. "It is done," he said, his voice weary. "The demon is locked back in its own prison." The battle was over. Maya was saved. Ben held her, an immense sense of relief washing away all the fear and fatigue. But he knew there was one last thing to do. The ledger, the demonic relic, had to be destroyed forever, so that the whispers from Serenity Hills would never have a chance to rise again. Maya woke up to a silence she no longer remembered. No whispers. No sick compulsions. No feeling of being watched from the inside. Only an emptiness, but a peaceful emptiness, like a room that has just been cleaned after a long period of neglect. She was lying on a simple bamboo bed, covered with a thin blanket. The warm morning sun shone through the window, carrying the scent of plants and damp earth. Ben was slumped in a chair beside her bed, his hand still holding hers even in his sleep. He looked gaunt and tired, but his expression was relaxed, free of the extreme tension from before. Maya stirred slightly, and Ben instantly woke up. Seeing her awake, her eyes clear and her own, he was speechless, only managing to squeeze her hand tighter, burying his face in it to hide the tears of relief that were about to fall. "I'm back," Maya said softly, her voice still weak. "Yeah," Ben nodded, looking up and smiling at her, a real smile after so many days. "You're back." A little later, the sage of Vin entered, followed by Mrs. Lon. The old man looked at Maya with kind eyes. "How do you feel, daughter?" he asked. "Empty. But very relieved," Maya replied. "Thank you, sage." The sage nodded gently. "You won the hardest battle yourself. But it is not over yet." He glanced toward the corner of the room, where the blue ledger lay on a small table, covered by a red cloth embroidered with strange symbols. "His spirit is completely trapped inside now. It cannot escape, nor can it influence anyone else. But it still exists. This book is now a prison, a ticking time bomb. If someone with a will weak enough or evil enough touches it, it could find a way out again. It must be completely destroyed." "Can't we just burn it?" Ben asked. "Ordinary fire is not enough," the sage shook his head. "It will only destroy the physical book, and the spirit within will be released, becoming an even more powerful vengeful spirit, no longer bound by a physical anchor. We need a fire with the power of purification. A fire that can melt metal and incinerate a soul." He explained the final plan. Not far away was a traditional blacksmithing village. The forge there had been burning for hundreds of years, its fire fed by charcoal and believed to have purifying powers. They would use that earthly but powerful flame to end the demonic relic. Maya, though still very weak, insisted on going. This was her demon, and she had to witness its destruction with her own eyes for her mind to be truly free. They arrived at the forge at noon. The heat from the furnace was intense. The bellows wheezed, and the clang of hammer on anvil filled the air. The old blacksmith, a friend of the sage, was waiting. He didn't ask many questions, just nodded solemnly as the sage explained briefly. The ledger was placed in a long pair of iron tongs. Maya, Ben, Mrs. Lon, and the sage stood at a safe distance from the forge. The blacksmith used the tongs to slowly bring the book toward the mouth of the roaring fire. As soon as the heat touched it, the book began to vibrate violently. An inhuman, mournful hiss came from within it, even though it was just an inanimate object. "Hold fast," the sage said loudly, his hands forming a complex mudra. "Do not let its cries sway you." The blacksmith pushed the tongs forward. The book fell into the heart of the inferno. For a moment, a horrifying scene unfolded. The flames flared violently, turning from orange to a ghostly green. From within the fire, a faint human face formed, the face of Professor Alastair Croft, distorted by rage and pain. It let out a silent scream, trying to reach out of the fire but held back by some invisible force. The leather cover of the book warped and then burned black. The yellowed pages curled and turned to ash. Maya saw the words, the names, the demonic formulas of the Morning Light Project appear one last time in the flames before vanishing. The screaming faded. The face in the flames disintegrated. The book lost its shape, melting and merging with the charcoal and fire, becoming a black, soulless slag. The fire in the forge returned to its normal orange color. It was over. Truly over. Maya let out a long breath. She felt she had been holding her entire life. The final burden had been lifted. She leaned against Ben's shoulder, feeling an absolute peace. 1 year later. The land where the Serenity Hills Pediatric Institute once stood was now a construction site, bustling with the sounds of work and laughter. But they weren't building another high-rise or resort. They were building a children's welfare center and a community park. The project was designed by a small but dedicated architectural firm. The lead architect was a young woman named Maya Tran. Maya stood on a nearby hill with Ben, looking down at the structure taking shape. She was no longer the girl haunted by her past. The invisible scars were still there, but they no longer ached. They were just reminders of a battle she had won. Her designs were completely different now. No more heavy lines or enclosed spaces. Instead, there were open areas, flooded with natural light, with small gardens and playful, winding paths. She was creating a place of healing, a place of life. "It's beautiful," Ben said, putting his arm around her shoulder. "I want to make this a place where the memory of those children is honored with joy," Maya said softly. "Not with pity, but with the laughter of other children." She had turned her pain into strength, collapse into rebirth. It was the sweetest revenge against Professor Croft and his sick philosophy. As the sun set behind the pine ridges, painting the sky in shades of red, Maya and Ben remained standing there. They said nothing more, just stood together in silence. The ghost of Serenity Hills had truly vanished, not because it was erased, but because it had been replaced by something much more powerful. Life and hope.